Rome, in the autumn of 42 BC, existed in a state of suspension between the republic that was dying and the empire that had not yet been born. The great families who had governed for centuries still occupied their ancestral homes on the Palatine Hill, still walked through forums where their ancestors' statues watched with marble eyes, still performed the rituals of a political system that civil war was systematically dismantling. Beneath the surface of familiar routines, everyone understood that the old order was ending, though no one could predict what would replace it. The house of the Claudii Nerones stood among the most ancient of Rome's patrician families, their lineage stretching back to the earliest days of the Republic, through generations of consuls, censors, and commanders whose achievements had become indistinguishable from Roman history itself. Into this household, on the 16th day of November, a son was born and given his father's name, according to traditions that assumed such names would continue to carry weight in the world the child would inherit. Tiberius Claudius Nero entered a world that his family's prominence could no longer guarantee would treat him gently. His father had made choices during the recent conflicts that now placed the family in considerable danger. The elder Tiberius Claudius Nero had supported Julius Caesar, then, after the dictator's assassination, had aligned himself with Mark Antony against the forces that would eventually coalesce around Caesar's heir Octavian. Such calculations had seemed reasonable when made, but the shifting fortunes of civil war transformed yesterday's prudent alliance into today's fatal liability with a speed that left little room for adjustment. The infant Tiberius was barely a year old when his family joined the flight from Rome that the Perusian War made necessary. His father had backed the wrong faction once again, supporting Antony's brother Lucius in a conflict that Octavian's forces crushed with efficiency that left the defeated scrambling for whatever safety distance might provide. The child's earliest experiences included journeys that no one would have chosen, hurried departures, uncertain destinations, the anxiety of adults whose fears a toddler could sense without understanding. Sicily received the refugees first, then Greece, then wherever the political winds seemed to offer temporary shelter from consequences that pursued them across the Mediterranean. The boy who would one day rule an empire spent his first years as a fugitive, his family's ancient name providing no protection against the realities of power that civil war had stripped to brutal essentials. These experiences left marks that later decades would reveal, in a personality shaped by early lessons about how quickly fortune could reverse itself. His mother, Livia Drusilla, endured these wanderings while pregnant with a second son, her condition adding physical hardship to political danger. The birth of Nero Claudius Drusus in 38 BC completed a family whose future remained entirely uncertain. Two small boys and their parents, dependent on the continued tolerance of powers, whose patience might exhaust itself at any moment. Survival required the kind of careful navigation that left no room for the pride that aristocratic heritage might otherwise have encouraged. The transformation that rescued the Claudii Nerones from obscurity came through means that ancient sources treated with varying degrees of scandal and admiration. Octavian encountered Livia and determined to marry her, despite the inconvenience of existing marriages on both sides and her advanced pregnancy with Drusus. The elder Tiberius Claudius Nero found himself compelled to divorce a wife whose charms had attracted attention more powerful than any husband could contest. Political calculation may have sweetened his compliance. Alliance with the rising power offered restoration that continued exile would never provide. The wedding that joined Livia to Octavian in January of 38 BC transformed 4-year-old Tiberius from fugitive child to stepson of the man who would become Augustus. The boy remained in his father's household initially, Roman custom preserving paternal authority, even when maternal circumstances had changed so dramatically. But the connection to Octavian's house now defined possibilities that his father's failed political choices had seemed to foreclose permanently. His father died in 33 BC, leaving 9-year-old Tiberius to deliver the funeral eulogy that custom required of eldest sons. The boy who stood before assembled mourners, speaking words that others had helped him compose, demonstrated qualities that would characterize his entire life. The capacity to perform public duties that private feelings might have made impossible. The discipline to meet expectations that his own inclinations did not generate. The father he eulogized had given him life, a name, and early experiences of instability that would shape everything that followed. The household that received Tiberius and his brother Drusus after their father's death operated according to rhythms that Octavian's growing power established. Their mother had become one of the most influential women in Rome. Her position as wife to the man who was systematically eliminating rivals and consolidating authority, placing her sons in proximity to power that their birth alone would never have provided. The Palatine residence where they now lived looked out over a city that their stepfather was transforming from the chaotic capital of a dying republic into the orderly center of an emerging empire. Education proceeded according to patterns that aristocratic Roman families had developed over generations, though the resources now available exceeded what the Claudii Nerones could have provided from their own diminished fortunes. Theodorus of Gadara, a rhetorician whose reputation drew students from throughout the Greek-speaking world, supervised the boys' training in the arts of persuasion that Roman public life required. Young Tiberius proved an apt student whose mastery of Greek would eventually exceed what most Roman aristocrats achieved. His facility with the language reflecting both natural ability and the serious attention he devoted to studies that less dedicated pupils treated as mere social polish. The brothers who grew up together in Octavian's household developed the bond that shared circumstances and complementary temperaments could create. Drusus emerged as the more naturally charming of the two, his ease with people contrasting with Tiberius's reserve in ways that observers would note throughout their lives. Yet the connection between them ran deeper than personality differences might suggest, their relationship providing each with the understanding that family members who had weathered common difficulties could offer. Rome itself was changing around them as Octavian completed the work of eliminating rivals and establishing the systems that would govern the empire for centuries. The final defeat of Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC removed the last significant challenge to his dominance. The suicides at Alexandria, closing a chapter of civil conflict that had consumed Roman energies for generations. The boy Tiberius witnessed the triumph that celebrated this victory. The procession through Rome's streets displaying the wealth of Egypt and the consequences of opposing the power that his stepfather now wielded without serious competition. The constitutional settlement of 27 BC gave Octavian the name Augustus and formalized arrangements that preserved republican appearances, while concentrating real authority in hands that would never willingly release it. Tiberius was 15 years old when these changes took effect, mature enough to understand their significance, while young enough to have no memory of the genuine republic that his elders had known. The world he was preparing to enter had been shaped by his stepfather's will, its possibilities defined by proximity to a power that family connection now guaranteed. The training appropriate for young men of his class combined intellectual cultivation with physical preparation for the military service that Roman aristocrats were expected to perform. Tiberius developed the strength and endurance that campaigning would require, his body hardening through exercises that the Campus Martius provided, alongside hundreds of other young Romans whose families harbored similar ambitions. Yet his temperament remained distinct from the easy confidence that many of his peers displayed, a seriousness settling over features that would grow more austere as years accumulated. His relationship with Augustus never achieved the warmth that stepfathers and stepsons sometimes developed. The emperor treated both boys with the formal correctness that duty required, their education and advancement receiving appropriate attention, without the affection that might have transformed obligation into genuine connection. Tiberius learned early that his position depended on usefulness rather than love, that the doors his mother's marriage had opened would remain open only as long as he proved himself worthy of walking through them. The reserve that characterized his public demeanor likely developed as response to circumstances that rewarded caution over spontaneity. A household dominated by Augustus's calculations offered little space for the unguarded expression that more secure environments might have permitted. Every word, every gesture, every relationship carried implications that extended beyond personal preference into the political calculations that governed everything around him. The serious child became a serious young man whose interior life remained hidden behind a facade that few would ever penetrate. By his late teens, Tiberius had acquired the education, the physical capabilities, and the family connections that qualified him for the public career that men of his class were expected to pursue. His mother's influence, his stepfather's position, and his own demonstrated abilities combined to open paths that would lead first to military command, then to responsibilities that no one, perhaps least of all Tiberius himself, could have anticipated when his family fled Rome in the chaos of civil war. The young man who prepared to begin his service to Rome carried within him the marks of an unusual childhood, the early experiences of flight and uncertainty, the loss of his father, the transition into a household where power concentrated in ways that Roman tradition had never contemplated. These experiences had produced someone cautious, where others were bold, reserved where others were open, thoughtful where others acted on impulse. Whether such qualities would prove assets or liabilities in the world Augustus was creating remained to be seen. The marble temples that his stepfather was raising across Rome gleamed in sunlight that fell equally on ancient shrines and new constructions. The city was becoming something unprecedented, capital of an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria, center of a power that no single man had ever wielded over such extent, and a young Claudian, heir to centuries of aristocratic tradition, but shaped by experiences his ancestors could never have imagined, was about to discover what role he might play in the order that Augustus had imposed upon a world exhausted by generations of civil war. The mission that carried Tiberius eastward in 20 BC announced that Augustus considered his stepson ready for responsibilities that would test capabilities his education had only theoretically developed. The task itself combined diplomatic delicacy with symbolic importance that exceeded its practical military significance. Rome wanted the standards that Crassus had lost to the Parthians at Carrhae 33 years before, their recovery erasing a humiliation that had festered in Roman memory since that catastrophic defeat. The young man who travelled toward Armenia carried the weight of expectations that failure would not satisfy. At 22, he possessed the education and training that aristocratic upbringing provided, but lacked the experience that only actual command could develop. The officers who accompanied him included veterans whose service predated his birth, their presence ensuring that youthful inexperience would be tempered by counsel from men who understood the realities that formal education could not convey. The negotiations that secured the standard's return proceeded through channels that Armenian intermediaries facilitated the Parthian king calculating that the symbolic concession cost less than the conflict that refusal might provoke. Tiberius conducted himself with the gravity that the situation demanded, his natural reserve serving purposes that more effusive personalities might have undermined. The eagles that returned to Roman custody represented victory without battle, diplomacy achieving what Crassus's legions had died failing to defend. Augustus celebrated the recovery with enthusiasm that the accomplishment's modest military character might not have seemed to warrant. The propaganda value of standards regained exceeded any territorial acquisition, their return allowing claims of Parthian submission that the actual diplomatic exchange had not quite established. Tiberius received credit appropriate to his role, while understanding that the achievement reflected his stepfather's strategic patience more than any brilliance he himself had displayed. The years following this initial success carried Tiberius across frontiers, where Roman expansion continued, despite the peace that Augustus's domestic settlement had established. The Alps presented challenges that generations of commanders had addressed without achieving permanent solutions, their valleys harboring peoples whose raids disrupted communications between Italy and the northern provinces. Augustus determined to settle this problem definitively, assigning his stepsons to campaigns that would extend Roman control across the entire mountain range. Tiberius and Drusus operated in coordination that their shared upbringing had prepared them to achieve, their forces advancing from different directions toward objectives that strategic planning had identified. The campaign of 15 BC carried Roman arms against the Raeti and Vindelici, peoples whose mountain strongholds had resisted previous attempts at subjugation. The brothers proved complementary in ways that maximized their combined effectiveness. Drusus's dash balanced by Tiberius's methodical thoroughness, each compensating for qualities the other possessed in lesser measure. The alpine landscapes through which these campaigns proceeded offered beauty that military necessity could not entirely obscure. Morning mists rose from valleys, where rivers had carved passages through rock over countless millennia, their waters cold with snowmelt that peaks retained even in summer months. Forests of pine and fir covered slopes too steep for agriculture, their shadows sheltering wildlife that fled before advancing columns. Tiberius developed during these campaigns the appreciation for natural settings that would later draw him toward retreats far from Rome's crowded streets. Military life suited his temperament in ways that political existence never would. The clarity of command, the defined responsibilities, the straightforward relationship between effort and result, these aspects of campaigning provided satisfaction that civilian honors could not match. His soldiers learned to trust a commander who shared their hardships without complaint, whose orders reflected understanding of conditions on the ground, rather than theories developed in comfortable headquarters. The reputation for patient, competent leadership that would define his military career began forming in these alpine valleys. The subjugation of the mountain peoples proceeded through seasons that alternated between active campaigning and the consolidation that permanent conquest required. Roads pushed through passes that previous generations had considered impassable, their construction demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities, while creating the infrastructure that would make the new provinces economically viable. Forts rose at strategic points where garrisons could monitor traffic and respond to any renewal of resistance. The Alps were becoming Roman in ways that casual raiding could never reverse. Marriage came to Tiberius during these years of military success, his bride a woman whose connections reinforced the ties binding him to Augustus's inner circle. Vipsania Agrippina was the daughter of Marcus Agrippa, the general and administrator whose capabilities had proven essential to everything Augustus had achieved. The union represented political calculation of the kind that governed aristocratic marriages, yet something warmer developed between the reserved young commander and the wife whose temperament apparently complemented his own. Their household provided Tiberius with domestic contentment that his public life's demands made precious. A son arrived whom they named Drusus, after the brother whose companionship meant so much. The child representing continuity that Roman families valued alongside more immediate satisfactions. Vipsania's presence offered refuge from responsibilities that multiplied, as Augustus found additional uses for a stepson whose competence continued proving itself across varied assignments. The Germanic frontier drew Roman attention with increasing urgency as the Alpine campaigns concluded. Beyond the Rhine lay territories that Roman arms had never subdued, their peoples posing threats that defensive arrangements could contain but not eliminate. Augustus envisioned expansion that would carry Roman boundaries to the Elbe, shortening frontier lines while incorporating lands whose resources might justify the costs that conquest would impose. Drusus received command of the forces assigned to realize this vision, his brother supporting operations from positions that strategy required. The campaigns that followed tested Roman capabilities against enemies whose fighting qualities exceeded what Alpine tribes had offered. Germanic warriors who had harassed Roman frontiers for generations now faced invasion that threatened their homelands with the subjugation that peoples further south had already experienced. Drusus drove his forces deep into territories that no Roman army had previously penetrated, his successes raising hopes that the Germanic problem might find the same solution that had pacified Gaul a generation before. Tiberius watched his brother's campaigns with the mixture of pride and concern that genuine affection produced. Drusus took risks that his own temperament would have avoided, his boldness achieving results that caution might have foreclosed, while creating dangers that luck alone could not indefinitely survive. The brothers who had grown up together, who had campaigned together, who had shared the peculiar circumstances of their childhood, remained close despite the distances that separate commands imposed. The summons that disrupted Tiberius's life arrived with the brutal abruptness that Augustus's decisions often displayed. Agrippa had died in 12 BC, leaving Julia, Augustus's daughter and only child, a widow whose remarriage became a matter of state concern. The emperor determined that Tiberius would divorce Vipsania and marry Julia, the arrangement serving dynastic purposes that personal happiness could not be permitted to obstruct. The command allowed no discussion, no appeal, no consideration of the contentment it would destroy. Tiberius complied because compliance was the only option that power structures permitted. He divorced a wife he apparently loved to marry a woman whose character and conduct would prove incompatible with his own temperament. The sources preserved an incident that revealed the cost this sacrifice imposed. Encountering Vipsania by chance after their divorce, Tiberius followed her with his eyes so full of tears that arrangements were made to ensure they never met again. The wound this episode represented would never fully heal, its pain adding to the accumulating weight that public duty placed upon private feeling. Julia brought to their marriage a nature that contrasted with everything her new husband valued. Where he was reserved, she was flamboyant. Where he sought privacy, she demanded attention. Where he found satisfaction in duty fulfilled, she pursued pleasures that would eventually scandalize Rome and destroy her father's hopes for her future. The mismatch proved as complete as the political logic that had created it was inexorable. They produced a son who died in infancy, the loss adding grief to an union that provided little else to share. The consulship came twice during these years, in 13 BC and again in 7 BC, each tenure confirming Tiberius's position among the empire's most important figures, while adding responsibilities that his temperament found burdensome. He performed the office's duties with the competence that characterized everything he undertook. Yet the political aspects of civilian magistracy suited him less comfortably than military command had done. The Senate's deference, the public ceremonies, the constant visibility that high office imposed. These requirements drained energies that campaigning seemed to restore. His brother's death in 9 BC struck with a force that nothing in Tiberius's experience had prepared him to absorb. Drusus had fallen from his horse during the Germanic campaigns, the injury developing complications that killed him before Tiberius could reach his side. The brother who had shared his childhood, who had complemented his capabilities so perfectly, who had provided connection and understanding that no one else could offer. This irreplaceable companion was suddenly gone, leaving emptiness that nothing would ever fill. Tiberius accompanied his brother's body back to Rome in a journey that ancient sources described with details suggesting the depth of grief involved. He walked before the cortege for much of the distance, his presence honoring the dead while punishing the living body that had failed to arrive in time. The funeral that followed provided public ritual for loss that remained intensely private, the ceremonies offering forms for grief without alleviating its substance. The tribunician power that Augustus granted in 6 BC confirmed Tiberius's position as the emperor's most important subordinate, the honor placing him in association with authority that only Augustus himself possessed in full measure. The distinction should have satisfied ambitions that his family's history had cultivated for generations. Instead, it seemed to crystallize dissatisfactions that had accumulated through years of demands that left no space for the life he might have chosen for himself. He requested permission to withdraw from public responsibilities, his petition citing the need for rest that continuous service had exhausted. Augustus refused initially, the emperor's plans requiring capabilities that Tiberius alone among available candidates possessed. The discussions that followed revealed depths of unhappiness that surprised those who had seen only the competent surface that public duty presented. Tiberius wanted what no one in his position could easily obtain: relief from expectations that his birth, his connections, and his abilities had combined to impose. The permission that finally came carried implications that neither grantor nor recipient fully anticipated. Augustus allowed his stepson to depart, though the emperor's displeasure at the request remained evident. Tiberius would go to Rhodes, would pursue the studies that genuine intellectual interests made appealing, would seek in that distant island the peace that Rome could never provide. The departure that followed would reshape his life in ways that the exhausted general sailing away from Italy could not possibly foresee. The ship that carried Tiberius toward Rhodes traced routes that merchant vessels had followed for centuries, its course passing islands whose names evoked the mythology that Greek tutors had made familiar during his childhood education. The Aegean spread around him in colors that Italian waters rarely achieved, blues deepening toward purple where depths increased, greens shading the shallows near coastlines that seemed to float between sea and sky. Each mile that passed beneath the hull added distance from responsibilities he had found crushing and relationships that had brought more pain than satisfaction. Roads rose from the sea as his destination approached, the island's hills terraced with cultivation that centuries of human effort had imposed upon landscapes that nature had left rougher. The famous Colossus no longer stood. An earthquake had toppled it long before Tiberius's birth. But the city that bore the island's name retained prosperity, that its strategic position along eastern trade routes sustained. Here, Greek culture flourished with a purity that Rome's cosmopolitan mixing had diluted. The philosophical schools and astronomical observations that drew Tiberius, continuing traditions that stretched back to ages when Rome had been merely a village beside the Tiber. The house he established made no claims to the grandeur that his position might have justified. Modest quarters suited both his temperament and the purposes that had drawn him to this place, their simplicity announcing withdrawal from the competitive display that Roman aristocratic life demanded. Servants sufficient for basic needs replaced the elaborate household that a man of his rank typically maintained. The message conveyed by these arrangements reached observers both on the island and in the distant capital. Tiberius sought obscurity rather than the attention that more ambitious exiles might have cultivated. His days developed rhythms that military command and political responsibility had never permitted. Morning hours found him attending lectures by philosophers whose schools maintained the traditions that had made Greek thought foundational to educated discourse throughout the Mediterranean world. The Stoic teachings that particularly attracted him offered frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual will and external circumstance. Their emphasis on accepting what could not be changed, while focusing effort on what remained within one's control, resonating with experiences that had taught similar lessons through harsher methods. Astronomy provided another focus for intellectual energies that administrative duties had previously consumed. The clear skies that Rhodes's climate offered revealed celestial movements with precision that Italy's hazier atmosphere often obscured. Tiberius studied with Thrasyllus, an astrologer whose reputation had drawn students from throughout the Greek-speaking world. Their sessions exploring the mathematical relationships that governed planetary motions and the significance that ancient traditions attributed to celestial configurations. The companion he found in Thrasyllus would remain with him for the rest of his life, their bond transcending the formal relationship between teacher and student. The locals who encountered this unusual resident treated him with respect that his manner invited without demanding. He walked through streets where shopkeepers and laborers recognized him, his greetings reflecting genuine interest in people whose lives proceeded according to concerns entirely removed from imperial politics. The reserve that had made Roman social life uncomfortable here became simply quietness, his preference for observation over participation, raising no questions in a culture that valued contemplation alongside action. Yet the peace that Rhodes provided could not entirely insulate him from the world he had left behind. Dispatches from Rome arrived with news that reminded him how thoroughly his fate remained entangled with events occurring far from his island retreat. Augustus's plans for succession continued evolving around figures whose prominence had increased as Tiberius's voluntary withdrawal had decreased his own. Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Julia's sons by her first marriage to Agrippa, whom Augustus had adopted as his own, received honors and responsibilities that positioned them as the emperor's intended heirs. The implications of these developments for Tiberius's own future grew more troubling as years passed. His tribunician power expired without renewal. The authority that had marked him as Augustus's chief subordinate now lapsed into the mere memory of distinction once held. Requests to return to Rome met refusals that grew sharper with each repetition, Augustus's anger at the departure apparently hardening rather than softening as time passed. What had begun as voluntary withdrawal was transforming into something closer to exile, the difference between the two categories mattering more as the possibility of return seemed to diminish. Julia's disgrace arrived as news that must have produced complicated emotions in the husband she had driven toward this distant refuge. In 2 BC, Augustus discovered, or could no longer ignore, the adulteries that his daughter had conducted with a recklessness suggesting either desperation or contempt for consequences. The emperor's response combined personal anguish with political calculation. His public denunciation of Julia preceding her exile to an island whose isolation would prevent further scandals while preserving her life against the capital punishment that her offences technically warranted. Tiberius learned of these events from the distance that geography imposed, his reaction unknown but imaginable. The marriage that had cost him Vipsania had now cost Julia everything that imperial birth had provided. Whatever satisfaction he might have felt at her fall was probably tempered by awareness that her disgrace complicated rather than clarified his own position. Augustus had lost the daughter whose children represented his preferred succession plan. Whether that loss might redirect attention toward the stepson who had removed himself from consideration remained entirely uncertain. The years in Rhodes accumulated with a slowness that contemplative life emphasized. Seasons marked by agricultural rhythms replaced the urgent deadlines that military campaigns and political obligations had imposed. Tiberius grew older in circumstances that allowed reflection on experiences whose significance continuous activity had obscured. The losses that had accumulated, his father, his brother, his marriage to Vipsania, the child who had died in infancy, could be examined with attention that busier years had denied. Whether such examination brought healing or merely sharpened awareness of wounds that time could not close, the sources do not reveal. His mother's influence worked on his behalf in Rome, through channels that distance made invisible, but persistence made effective. Livia understood the political landscape with sophistication that her years beside Augustus had developed, her interventions on Tiberius's behalf proceeding through approaches calibrated to circumstances that shifted with events she monitored carefully. The deaths that began removing Augustus's preferred heirs created opportunities that her advocacy could exploit once the emperor's resistance to reconciliation began weakening. Lucius Caesar died in AD 2, the younger of Julia's sons succumbing to illness while traveling to military assignment in Spain. The loss struck Augustus with force that his advanced years made harder to absorb. The grandson, who had represented half his succession plan, suddenly removed from calculations that had seemed secure. 18 months later, Gaius Caesar died from wounds received during Armenian operations, his death completing the destruction of arrangements that had seemed to guarantee the empire's future in Julia's bloodline. Augustus faced a situation that his preference for alternatives to Tiberius could no longer avoid. The stepsons, whose abilities he had exploited while favoring others, now represented the only capable candidates available for responsibilities that the emperor's age made increasingly urgent. Drusus was dead, but Tiberius remained, older, perhaps wiser, certainly changed by years of removal from the pressures that had driven him away. Whatever reservations Augustus retained about the man whose departure had angered him, practical necessity was overriding personal sentiment. The recall that reached Rhodes in AD 2 ended an exile that had lasted 8 years. Tiberius received permission to return with emotions that sources do not adequately describe. Relief at restoration, perhaps, mixed with awareness that return meant resuming burdens that departure had sought to escape. The island that had provided refuge would remain in memory as proof that another kind of life was possible, its quiet routines contrasting with everything that awaited him in the capital, whose demands had once seemed unbearable. The journey westward reversed the route that had carried him toward Rhodes years before, the same islands passing as his ship traced courses that countless vessels had followed across the Aegean and into Italian waters. The man who returned was not the man who had departed. 8 years of study, reflection, and distance had altered perspectives that continuous immersion in Roman affairs had previously fixed in patterns that exhaustion had made intolerable. Whether these changes had equipped him better for the responsibilities ahead, or merely added layers of complexity to a personality already difficult to read, the coming years would reveal. Rome received him with the formal acknowledgement that his position required, and the wariness that his long absence had encouraged. He was no longer the active commander whose campaigns had extended Roman power across multiple frontiers, no longer the vigorous administrator whose competence had made him invaluable. He was approaching 50, an age when Roman aristocrats who had survived so long often began contemplating the dignified retirement that accumulated service had earned. Instead, Tiberius faced the prospect of responsibilities that would exceed anything his earlier career had demanded. Augustus treated his returned stepson with the calculation that characterized all the emperor's significant relationships. Tiberius would be useful, perhaps essential, but affection was not something that their history permitted or present circumstances encouraged. The adoption that would formally make Tiberius Augustus's son and heir still lay in the future, its timing dependent on developments that neither could yet foresee. For now, the returned exile occupied an ambiguous position, too important to ignore, too complicated to fully trust, too necessary to treat with the coldness that genuine feeling might have preferred. The philosophical training that Rhodes had provided would be tested in the years ahead by circumstances that no stoic preparation could have anticipated. The man who had sought peace in contemplation would find himself drawn back into activity that the empire's needs made unavoidable. The reserve that had developed through childhood instability, painful losses, and deliberate withdrawal would harden further under pressures that the position he was approaching would impose. Tiberius had returned to Rome, but the tranquility he had found on Rhodes would never be recaptured in the world that now reclaimed him. The adoption that formalized Tiberius's position as Augustus's heir took place on the 26th of June in AD 4, the legal ceremony transforming a stepson into a son, with all the implications that Roman family law attached to such transitions. Tiberius Claudius Nero became Tiberius Julius Caesar, his new name announcing incorporation into the family that ruled the world, while erasing the Claudian identity that centuries of ancestors had carried. The man who emerged from this ritual was legally someone new, though the memories and character that adoption could not alter remained unchanged. The arrangement carried conditions that revealed Augustus's continuing ambivalence about the succession he was establishing. Tiberius was required to adopt his nephew Germanicus as his own son, the young man's position thereby secured, regardless of whatever preferences Tiberius himself might hold regarding his biological son Drusus. The stipulation ensured that the bloodline Augustus favored, Germanicus, was the son of the beloved Drusus and grandson of Mark Antony's daughter, would continue toward the purple even if it had to pass through Tiberius to get there. The new heir understood that he was instrument as much as beneficiary of plans whose ultimate purposes extended beyond his own advancement. Germanicus brought to the imperial household qualities that complemented and contrasted with those of his adoptive father. The young man possessed the easy charm that his father Drusus had displayed, his manner winning affection from soldiers and civilians with an effortlessness that Tiberius could never replicate. Their relationship would prove complicated across the years ahead, duty binding them together, while temperament and perhaps rivalry created distances that formal adoption could not bridge. For now, the arrangement served Augustus's purposes by providing alternatives that reduced dependence on any single individual. Military responsibilities reclaimed Tiberius almost immediately upon his return from Rhodes, his capabilities too valuable to leave unemployed when frontiers required attention that other commanders could not adequately provide. The Germanic territories that his brother had tried to conquer remained restive, their pacification incomplete, despite years of campaigning that had cost Roman lives without producing the permanent subjugation that Augustus desired. Tiberius returned to landscapes he had known decades before, their forests and rivers now carrying memories of the brother whose death had contributed to the despair driving him toward Rhodes. The campaigns that followed demonstrated that neither age nor years of philosophical study had diminished the military competence that earlier service had developed. Tiberius commanded with the methodical patience that had always characterized his approach, his operations emphasizing consolidation over dramatic advances, his decisions reflecting awareness that sustainable results mattered more than impressive reports. The soldiers who served under him recognized qualities that flashier commanders often lacked: reliability, concern for their welfare, and judgment that avoided unnecessary risks while accepting those that strategic necessity required. The Great Illyrian Revolt that erupted in AD 6 presented challenges exceeding anything the empire had faced since the civil wars. Peoples across the Balkans, who had seemed pacified, rose in coordinated rebellion, whose scale threatened Roman control over territories essential to communications between Italy and the eastern provinces. The timing could hardly have been worse. Germanic operations had stretched resources that now faced demands from an entirely different direction. The empire's military capabilities suddenly inadequate for threats that multiplied faster than responses could be organized. Tiberius received command of forces assembled to suppress a revolt, whose magnitude became clearer as initial assessments gave way to harder information. The rebels numbered in the hundreds of thousands, their leaders displaying military sophistication that suggested careful preparation during years when Roman attention had focused elsewhere. The warfare that followed would consume 3 years and require troop concentrations that stripped other frontiers of protection they could barely spare. Augustus reportedly declared that the threat exceeded anything Rome had faced since Hannibal. The Illyrian campaigns tested Tiberius as nothing in his previous experience had done. The enemy combined knowledge of terrain with desperation that made conventional operations inadequate, their resistance continuing through defeats that would have broken less determined opponents. Tiberius adapted his methods to circumstances that changed with each season, his patience proving equal to challenges that would have driven more impetuous commanders toward the catastrophic mistakes that impatience so often produced. Slowly, methodically, at costs that mounted through campaigns whose end remained uncertain, Roman control was re-established over territories whose rebellion had threatened to unravel Augustus's entire achievement. The news from Germania that arrived in AD 9 demonstrated how quickly success in one theatre could be overshadowed by disaster in another. Publius Quinctilius Varus had led 3 legions into the Teutoburg forest, where Germanic forces under Arminius had destroyed them so completely that barely a survivor reached Roman lines to report what had happened. 17,000 soldiers, the equivalent of nearly a tenth of Rome's entire military establishment, had perished in forests that swallowed their bodies along with the eagles they had carried. The disaster exceeded Cannae in the totality of its destruction. Augustus reportedly wandered his palace, crying out for Varus to return his legions. The old emperor's grief revealing how completely the catastrophe had shattered assumptions about Germanic pacification. The frontiers that Tiberius's brother had died trying to advance now contracted toward the Rhine. Ambitions for an Elbe boundary, abandoned in recognition that available resources could not sustain positions that the Varus disaster had proven indefensible. The empire that had seemed limitless in its expansion now discovered limits that massacre had brutally established. Tiberius transferred from the Illyrian theatre to address the Germanic crisis, his presence required to stabilize a frontier whose collapse might encourage challenges elsewhere. The campaigns he conducted in AD 10 through 12 aimed not at reconquest, but at demonstrating that Roman power remained capable of punishing those who had inflicted such losses. Punitive expeditions carried fire and sword into territories whose inhabitants learned that the Teutoburg forest had not made them safe from consequences. The recovered remains of Varus's soldiers received burial that Roman piety required, their bones gathered from the sites where they had fallen 3 years before. The triumph that Rome awarded Tiberius in AD 12 celebrated achievements whose full extent few observers could appreciate. He had suppressed the Illyrian revolt that Augustus had compared to Hannibal's invasion, then stabilized a Germanic frontier that the Varus disaster had seemed to destroy. The procession that carried him through Rome's streets displayed prisoners and spoils that represented years of grinding warfare, conducted far from the audiences who now cheered results they had not witnessed being achieved. The honor marked recognition that his capabilities had preserved an empire whose survival had genuinely been threatened. Augustus was failing as these ceremonies unfolded, his health declining through years that added weight to a frame that had never been robust. The emperor who had built the system now faced the ultimate test of whether what he had constructed could survive his passing. Every arrangement he had made, every adoption he had conducted, every responsibility he had assigned aimed at ensuring continuity that his death would otherwise threaten. Tiberius stood at the center of these preparations, his position now unambiguous, even if the affection that might have accompanied it remained absent. The relationship between the aging emperor and his heir settled into patterns that duty, rather than warmth, sustained. They worked together on the administrative matters that governing an empire required, their conferences addressing details that ranged from frontier deployments to provincial appointments, to the countless decisions that concentrated power made unavoidable. Augustus relied on Tiberius's competence, while apparently never overcoming the reservations that earlier friction had created. Tiberius served with the diligence that his nature demanded, while likely never forgetting that he had been chosen by necessity rather than preference. Livia remained the connection that bound the household together, her influence with Augustus undiminished by the decades that had passed since their marriage had scandalized respectable opinion. Her son's position owed much to interventions she had made during the Rhodes years, her advocacy continuing through arrangements that the emperor's declining capacities made increasingly important. The imperial family that would manage the transition approaching represented her achievement as much as Augustus's planning, its configurations reflecting her judgment about how power might be preserved through the crisis that death would create. The summer of AD 14 brought Augustus to Nola, a town in Campania, where he sought relief from conditions that Roman heat made worse. Tiberius had departed on assignment to Illyricum when news reached him that the emperor's health had taken a final turn. He returned with speed that urgency demanded, arriving to find Augustus still alive, but clearly approaching the end that 76 years had made inevitable. The conversations that passed between them in those final days remained private, their content known only to participants whose discretion prevented details from reaching historians. Augustus died on the 19th of August, his passing ending a reign that had lasted over 40 years and transformed Rome from republic to empire. The man who had been Octavian, who had fought his way to power through civil wars that killed a generation, who had constructed systems of governance that would endure for centuries, breathed his last in the presence of the wife who had shared his journey, and the heir whose capabilities would determine whether what he had built would survive. The words attributed to him at the end, asking whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, captured something essential about a ruler who had always understood the performative aspects of power. Tiberius faced a transition that preparations had anticipated but could not entirely smooth. The Senate would need to confirm arrangements that Augustus had established. The legions would need to accept an emperor whose authority derived from adoption rather than the personal achievements that had legitimized his predecessor. The man who had sought escape to Rhodes now found himself holding responsibilities that no escape could address, his reluctance irrelevant to necessities that Augustus's death had created. The empire needed an emperor, and the only candidate whose position and capabilities qualified him for the role was the reserved, complicated 65-year-old man who had spent his life preparing for a burden he had never wanted to bear. The Senate convened to address the situation that Augustus's death had created, their deliberations proceeding through formalities that constitutional fictions required, while everyone understood that real power had already passed to the man whose legions guaranteed outcomes that senatorial votes merely ratified. Tiberius accepted authority with a hesitation that some interpreted as modesty and others as manipulation. His reluctance to embrace powers that he would exercise for over 2 decades, creating impressions whose accuracy historians would debate for centuries. The second emperor of Rome took up responsibilities that would define the remainder of his life, his accession marking not triumph, but the assumption of burdens that would grow heavier with each passing year. The boy who had fled Rome as an infant, who had lost his father and brother, who had been forced to divorce the wife he loved, who had sought peace in Rhodes only to be dragged back to duties he had tried to escape. This man now held power exceeding anything his ancestors could have imagined. Whether he would use it well, whether the empire would prosper or suffer under his guidance, whether history would judge him fairly, these questions awaited answers that only the coming decades could provide. The transition of power that Augustus's death required proceeded with a smoothness that careful preparation had made possible but could not guarantee. Tiberius addressed the Senate with words that emphasized continuity over change, his speech announcing intentions to preserve the system his predecessor had established rather than impose innovations that his own preferences might have suggested. The senators who listened understood that real power had already transferred regardless of constitutional formalities, yet the new emperor's deference to their institution provided comfort that autocracy's harsher forms might have denied. News from the frontiers interrupted these ceremonies of transition, with reminders that empires could not pause for succession rituals however significant. The legions stationed along the Rhine and Danube had received word of Augustus's death, with reactions that discipline should have prevented, their mutinies combining grievances about pay and service conditions, with uncertainty about whether the new emperor would prove as capable of commanding loyalty as his predecessor had been. The crisis demanded responses that senatorial deliberations could not provide. Germanicus confronted the Rhine mutiny with a combination of personal courage and emotional appeal that his temperament made natural. He walked among soldiers whose anger might have turned violent, his presence reminding them of connections that transcended temporary grievances. The theatrical gestures he employed, threatening suicide rather than witness dishonor, invoking his wife and children who accompanied him, suited a personality that drew strength from emotional display. The legions relented, their discipline restored through methods that Tiberius himself could never have replicated. Drusus the Younger addressed the Danube mutiny with approaches that reflected his own character rather than copying his cousin's example. Tiberius's son possessed qualities that differentiated him from Germanicus. Less charm, perhaps, but steadier judgment and temperament more closely resembling his father's reserve. He waited out the soldiers' anger with patience that allowed passions to exhaust themselves, then negotiated settlements that addressed legitimate complaints while reasserting the authority that mutiny had challenged. Both crises resolved without the catastrophic consequences that initial reports had threatened. The Germanic frontier that had consumed his brother's life and witnessed the Varus disaster drew Germanicus toward campaigns that combined strategic purpose with personal meaning. Augustus's death had not eliminated Roman interest in territories beyond the Rhine, and the young commander who embodied so many hopes led forces across the river in operations aimed at demonstrating that Roman power remained capable of punishing those who had destroyed Varus's legions. The campaigns of AD 14 through 16 carried Roman arms deep into forests, where massacres' memories lingered alongside bones that previous expeditions had buried. Tiberius monitored these operations from Rome, with attention that distance made anxious and experience made critical. Germanicus achieved victories that celebrations could commemorate, and recovered eagles that the Teutoburg forest had claimed. Yet the strategic value of his campaigns remained questionable to an emperor whose military judgment exceeded his adopted son's, despite the younger man's undeniable personal courage. The costs mounted in lives, in resources, in risks that bold advances into hostile territory created, while permanent results remained elusive. The recall that brought Germanicus home in AD 16 reflected Tiberius's assessment that Germanic operations had achieved whatever they could accomplish without investments that other needs made unavailable. The decision generated criticism from those who believed that continued campaigning might have completed what Germanicus had begun, their complaints contributing to suspicions that jealousy, rather than judgment, motivated the emperor's intervention. Tiberius endured such criticism with the stoic acceptance that his temperament and philosophical training both encouraged, his explanations failing to satisfy audiences who preferred simpler narratives about rivalry between an old emperor and his popular heir. Governance during these early years established patterns that would characterize Tiberius's entire reign. He worked with the Senate through consultations that treated the body as a genuine partner in administration, rather than merely a rubber stamp for imperial decisions. Senators found themselves invited to express opinions that the emperor actually considered, their expertise in legal and administrative matters contributing to policies that benefited from collective wisdom. The deference that Tiberius displayed towards senatorial dignity surprised those who had expected autocracy to express itself more blatantly. Financial management reflected the conservative instincts that the new emperor brought to every aspect of governance. Where Augustus had spent freely on building programs and public entertainments that cultivated popular support, Tiberius emphasized economy that accumulated reserves against future needs. The treasury that his predecessor had left well stocked grew further under administration that viewed expenditure with suspicion and taxation with reluctance. The prosperity that resulted from stable governance and fiscal prudence spread through provinces whose inhabitants experienced peace more consistently than any previous generation had known. Legal reforms addressed abuses that previous administrations had tolerated or failed to notice. Tiberius took personal interest in judicial proceedings, whose outcomes affected ordinary subjects as well as powerful interests, his interventions generally favoring stricter enforcement of protections that law provided the weak against exploitation by the strong. Provincial governors discovered that complaints from their subjects received attention in Rome. The emperor's willingness to investigate allegations of misconduct, discouraging the casual corruption that distance from oversight had previously encouraged. The Eastern Mediterranean required attention that domestic concerns could not indefinitely postpone. Client kingdoms, whose arrangements dated from Augustus's reign, needed adjustment as circumstances evolved and rulers died or proved inadequate. Tiberius assigned Germanicus to address these matters with authority that the young man's prestige and capabilities seemed to warrant, the appointment removing a potential rival from Rome, while employing talents that administrative challenges could usefully absorb. Germanicus travelled east with his wife Agrippina and their children, the household whose presence at the Rhine mutiny had proven so effective now, accompanying him toward responsibilities that would test different skills. The arrangements he made regarding Armenia and other client states demonstrated competence that justified the trust his assignment had represented. Yet the Eastern journey that had begun with such promise ended in circumstances that would poison Roman politics for years afterward. The illness that struck Germanicus at Antioch in AD 19 progressed through stages that physicians could not reverse, his condition deteriorating while those who loved him watched helplessly. He died believing himself the victim of poison, his accusations targeting Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria, whose conflicts with Germanicus had become notorious. Whether these suspicions reflected reality or the paranoia that fatal illness sometimes produces, the charges shaped responses to his death in ways that calm assessment might have prevented. Rome received news of Germanicus's passing with grief, whose intensity reflected the hopes his personality had inspired. The young commander whose charm had won hearts across the empire was dead at 33, his potential forever unrealized, his children orphaned, his wife returning to Rome bearing ashes that represented everything his admirers had lost. The mourning that followed exceeded anything Augustus's death had produced, the contrast suggesting how differently Romans had regarded the reserved old emperor and the charismatic young prince. Tiberius faced the aftermath of Germanicus's death with a composure that many interpreted as indifference and some suspected indicated guilt. His efforts to moderate mourning that threatened to become politically destabilizing earned criticism from those who expected more visible grief from an adoptive father. The trial of Piso that followed produced suicide rather than verdict, the accused taking his own life before proceedings could reach conclusions that might have clarified questions that his death left permanently unresolved. Rumors that Tiberius had orchestrated Germanicus's murder circulated despite the absence of evidence supporting them, suspicion attaching itself to an emperor whose reserve made him easy to distrust. The years following Germanicus's death saw Tiberius withdraw further from the public engagement that early reign had emphasized. He attended Senate meetings less frequently, his communications increasingly conveyed through letters rather than personal presence. The emotional cost of public life, never comfortable for his temperament, seemed to grow heavier as criticisms accumulated and the satisfaction of genuine accomplishment failed to compensate for burdens that power imposed. The philosophical detachment that Rhodes had cultivated reasserted itself as protection against wounds that continued exposure kept reopening. His son Drusus assumed responsibilities that the emperor's withdrawal made available, the young man's capabilities proving adequate to challenges that his father's confidence entrusted to him. Tribunician power passed to Drusus in recognition of his position as heir, the honor confirming succession arrangements that Germanicus's death had clarified, even as it had complicated family dynamics. Tiberius seemed to be preparing transition to a successor whose temperament more closely resembled his own than Germanicus's had done. Sejanus rose to prominence during these years through service that the emperor found increasingly indispensable. The prefect of the Praetorian Guard brought to his position ambitions that exceeded its traditional scope, his influence extending into areas that military command alone would not have justified. Tiberius relied on Sejanus for the management of affairs that his own withdrawal from daily administration required someone to handle. The trust that developed, reflecting genuine appreciation for competence that seemed to serve imperial interests without seeking improper advantage. The blow that fell in AD 23 destroyed the future that careful planning had constructed. Drusus died with suddenness, that illness inadequately explained. His passing leaving Tiberius without the heir whose capabilities had seemed adequate to responsibilities that succession would impose. The emperor who had already lost his brother, his first wife, and his adopted son, now lost the biological son whose position had seemed secure. Years later, evidence would emerge, suggesting that Sejanus had arranged Drusus's death through poison, administered by Livilla, Drusus's own wife. But at the time, only grief was certain, while its causes remained obscure. Tiberius confronted this loss with a fortitude that Stoic training had prepared, but could not make painless. He addressed the Senate shortly after Drusus's death, with composure that observers found remarkable, his words acknowledging loss while emphasizing continuity that the state required regardless of personal tragedy. The reserves of emotional control that his nature had developed proved adequate to public demands, even as private suffering surely continued beyond audiences that formal occasions provided. The succession that had seemed settled now required reconstruction from options that Germanicus's children represented. These boys, Nero, Drusus, and the young Gaius, whom soldiers had nicknamed Caligula, carried the bloodline that Augustus had preferred through their father's lineage. Their youth meant that years must pass before any could assume responsibilities that adult capability required. In the interim, administration would depend on arrangements that placed increasing weight on officials whose loyalty the emperor trusted. Sejanus benefited most from circumstances that Drusus's death had created, his position strengthening as alternatives diminished, and the emperor's withdrawal from active governance accelerated. The prefect, who had seemed merely useful, was becoming essential, his influence extending through networks of patronage and information that made him the unavoidable intermediary between emperor and empire. Whether this development served Rome's interests or merely Sejanus's ambitions remained unclear to observers whose access to the emperor had diminished as his reliance on the prefect had grown. The foundations of withdrawal that would characterize Tiberius's later reign were firmly established by the end of this period. Personal losses had accumulated beyond easy bearing. Public criticism had proven that competent governance earned no immunity from suspicion and complaint. The satisfactions that power might have provided seemed increasingly outweighed by costs that exercising it imposed. The island of Capri beckoned with promises of escape that Rhodes had once fulfilled, its cliffs and waters offering refuge from a world that the emperor found exhausting. The years ahead would test whether distance could provide the peace that presence had denied. The island rose from the Tyrrhenian Sea like a fortress designed by nature rather than human hands. Capri's cliffs climbed hundreds of feet from waters whose depths prevented easy landing, their limestone faces carved by millennia of wind and wave into formations that seemed to guard the heights above from uninvited approach. The few beaches that offered access could be watched and controlled, their narrowness ensuring that no force could arrive without detection and no visitor could land without permission. For an emperor seeking separation from a world that had worn him thin, the geography provided exactly what his soul required. Tiberius established himself on Capri in AD 26. His departure from Rome, carrying the finality that his retreat to Rhodes had once possessed, without the ambiguity about whether return might follow. He was 67 years old, had ruled for 12 years, and had endured losses and criticisms that made continued residence in the capital intolerable. The villa that received him perched on the island's highest point, its position commanding views that stretched toward horizons where sea and sky merged into indistinguishable blue. They called it Villa Jovis, the Villa of Jupiter, its name suggesting the divine associations that imperial residents encouraged. The complex that served as his final home combined the practical requirements of governance with the amenities that retirement deserved. Rooms designed for administrative work held the documents and secretaries that ruling an empire from a distance required. Quarters for the guards, whose presence security demanded occupied positions that controlled access without intruding on privacy. Gardens offered spaces for the contemplation that his philosophical training had cultivated, their plantings providing colour and fragrance that softened the stone severity of walls built to last centuries. The astronomical observations that had fascinated him since roads could continue from terraces, whose elevation and clear skies revealed celestial movements with precision that lower locations denied. The daily rhythms that developed on Capri resembled those that Rhodes had established decades before, though the responsibilities that followed him across the water prevented the complete withdrawal that his younger self had achieved. Couriers arrived bearing dispatches whose contents required decisions that only the emperor could authorize. Responses departed carrying instructions that administrators throughout the empire awaited. The machinery of governance continued functioning with the emperor as its ultimate authority, but the distance that now separated him from its daily operations transformed his relationship to power in ways that presence would not have permitted. Sejanus managed affairs in Rome with authority that the emperor's absence effectively delegated, his position strengthening as the physical distance between Capri and the capital made direct imperial supervision impossible. The prefect, who had risen through competent service, now operated with latitude that his nominal rank would not have justified, his decisions carrying weight that derived from proximity to power's daily exercise rather than formal constitutional position. Those who sought imperial favor learned that Sejanus's support was prerequisite, his opposition fatal, his indifference sufficient to doom ambitions that his endorsement might have advanced. The atmosphere in Rome darkened as the prefect consolidated control through methods that his position enabled and the emperor's distance permitted. Treason trials multiplied as accusations that served Sejanus's purposes received the attention that his influence with Tiberius guaranteed. Senators, whose independence threatened his dominance, found themselves facing charges whose outcomes seemed predetermined. The informers, whose profession Tiberius had initially discouraged, now flourished under a system where denunciation advanced careers and silence invited suspicion. Fear settled over political life with a weight that earlier years had not known. Germanicus's children suffered particularly as Sejanus moved to eliminate rivals whose bloodline might challenge the future he was constructing. Nero, the eldest, faced accusations that resulted in exile and eventual death. Drusus followed his brother into imprisonment, whose conditions ensured he would not survive. Agrippina, their mother, whose hostility to Sejanus had been vocal and unrelenting, found herself banished to an island where isolation matched her enemy's intentions. The family, whose popularity had once seemed to guarantee prominence, discovered that popularity provided no protection against power, concentrated in ruthless hands. Young Gaius, alone among Germanicus's sons, escaped destruction, his survival owing to age that made him seem unthreatening, and perhaps to calculations that Sejanus's plans required at least one member of the bloodline to remain available for arrangements not yet revealed. The boy whom soldiers had nicknamed Caligula lived in circumstances that taught lessons about power's brutality that would shape the emperor he would eventually become. His survival amid the destruction of his family marked him with experiences whose effects would become apparent only when his own turn at rule arrived. Tiberius received information about these developments through channels that Sejanus controlled. His understanding of events in Rome filtered through a source whose interests diverged from accurate reporting. The emperor, who had withdrawn from direct involvement, found himself dependent on assessments provided by the very individual whose activities most needed independent evaluation. The isolation that Capriya provided, so welcome as escape from burdens that presence imposed, now became a prison whose walls were built from ignorance rather than stone. The letters that passed between island and capital sustained a relationship whose reality grew increasingly disconnected from appearances that Sejanus cultivated. Tiberius trusted a subordinate whose loyalty was actually directed toward ambitions that required the emperor's removal. Sejanus planned betrayal while professing devotion, his patience extending across years during which positions strengthened and obstacles diminished. The consulship that he received in AD 31, shared with Tiberius himself, seemed to confirm that his ascent toward the purple was approaching its culmination. The revelation that shattered this edifice of deception arrived through Antonia, daughter of Mark Antony and mother of Germanicus, whose position outside Sejanus's networks allowed her to perceive what those closer to events could not safely report. Her letter to Tiberius detailed the prefect's treachery with specificity that could not be dismissed as jealousy or misunderstanding. The scales fell from the emperor's eyes with a suddenness that transformed understanding of everything the preceding years had contained. The trusted servant was revealed as the architect of destruction that had consumed the emperor's own family. The response that Tiberius constructed demonstrated that the capabilities which had made him formidable as a general had not atrophied during years of withdrawal. He could not simply arrest Sejanus. The prefect commanded the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty might prove stronger to their immediate commander than to an emperor they had not seen in years. Direct confrontation risked civil war, whose outcome remained uncertain. Instead, Tiberius proceeded with the patient deception that his enemy's own methods had perfected. Naevius Sutorius Macro received secret appointment as the new Praetorian prefect, his instructions detailing the operation that would remove Sejanus without the violence that open conflict would require. The condemned man received summons to a Senate meeting where he expected honors that would advance his position further, his confidence sustained by assurances that Tiberius continued to shower upon him even as the trap was being prepared. The letter that Tiberius sent to be read before the Senate began with the praise that Sejanus anticipated before transitioning into denunciation, whose completeness left no possibility of survival. The fall, when it came, proved as total as the rise that had preceded it. Sejanus was arrested in the Senate chamber by guards whose loyalty Macro had secured during the very meeting where the fatal letter was read. The execution that followed came within hours. The body that had commanded such fear now dragged through streets where crowds that had recently courted his favor now expressed the hatred that fear had suppressed. His children died with him, his statues were torn down. His memory was condemned to the damnation that Roman practice reserved for the most dangerous enemies of the state. The aftermath revealed the full extent of crimes that Sejanus's dominance had concealed. Evidence emerged connecting him to Drusus the Younger's death 8 years before. The poison administered by Livilla now documented through confessions that the prefect's fall made possible. The son, whose loss had accelerated Tiberius's withdrawal from governance, had been murdered by the very individual to whom that withdrawal had granted power. The emperor who learned this truth faced knowledge whose implications no stoic preparation could adequately address. The years following Sejanus's destruction brought no return to the engagement that earlier reign had displayed. Tiberius remained on Capri, his isolation now deepened by awareness of how thoroughly he had been deceived. Macro administered affairs in Rome with authority that recent events had transferred without fundamentally changing the arrangement that had proven so dangerous. The treason trials continued, their targets now including those whose association with Sejanus had compromised them regardless of whether their involvement had been willing or coerced. The reputation that Tiberius carried into history was being shaped during these final years by sources whose reliability later generations would struggle to assess. Tales of debauchery circulated describing behavior that the emperor's island isolation permitted rumor to elaborate without contradiction. The elderly man, whose reserve had characterized his entire life, was portrayed engaging in excesses that his temperament made implausible, even as his power made them theoretically possible. Whether these stories reflected reality, exaggeration, or pure invention would remain debatable long after their subject had passed beyond the possibility of response. The governance that continued beneath this surface of scandal and suspicion maintained the stability that earlier years had established. Provinces remained at peace under administrators whose competence reflected the systems that Tiberius had maintained. Frontiers held secure behind defenses, whose garrisons enforced boundaries that no enemy seriously threatened. The treasury accumulated surpluses that frugal management and peaceful conditions combined to produce. By measures that actually mattered for most inhabitants of the empire, the reign that hostile sources would condemn as tyrannical was providing benefits that more dramatic rulers often failed to deliver. Tiberius corresponded with Thrasyllus until the astrologer's death, their friendship sustaining connection to intellectual interests that political responsibilities had overshadowed without eliminating. The stars whose movements they had studied together in Rhodes continued their courses above Capri's heights, their patterns offering the order and predictability that human affairs so consistently failed to display. Whatever comfort celestial contemplation provided during these final years, it represented continuity with the period when escape had seemed possible and peace had briefly been achieved. Livia's death in AD 29 had severed the connection that had linked Tiberius to the household where his public life had begun. His mother had shaped his career through interventions whose full extent he may never have known. Her influence with Augustus securing opportunities that his own position would not have guaranteed. Their relationship had apparently cooled in later years. The honors he declined to authorize for her after Augustus's death suggesting distance whose causes sources do not adequately explain. Her passing removed the last figure whose presence recalled the world that had formed him. The cliffs of Capri caught the light of sunsets whose colors shifted through seasons that accumulated toward the ending now approaching. The emperor who had never wanted power had held it for over 2 decades, his reign delivering outcomes that competent administration produced while generating the resentments that authority always inspires. The isolation he had chosen provided protection from the world, whose demands had exhausted him, but it had also created the conditions that made Sejanus's treachery possible, and ensured that history would judge him by evidence that his enemies largely controlled. The final chapter was approaching for a man whose complexity would ensure that simple verdicts about his legacy would always prove inadequate.